I unintentionally touched the dying alien princess. Then she began to heal. The silence in the royal infirmary was thick enough to choke on, broken only by the frantic rhythmic chirping of the monitors that had, moments ago, signaled a flatline. Silas did not pull his hand away from Alcyone's face, even as the skin beneath his fingers began to glow with a fierce, violet intensity that mirrored the heat blooming in his own chest. He felt a thrumming vibration crawl up his arm, a physical manifestation of her spirit reaching out to latch onto the sheer, stubborn vitality of his Terran physiology. Her eyes, previously filmed over with the haze of approaching death, snapped open to reveal irises that looked like swirling nebulae of pink and gold. The physicians scrambled backward, their multi-jointed limbs clicking in agitation, but Silas remained anchored, his gaze locked onto the woman who was currently draining the very warmth from his blood to rebuild her own. "You are burning," Alcyone whispered, her voice a fragile rasp that sent a shiver straight down Silas's spine. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a delicate, trembling touch that felt like liquid electricity. "I can feel your heart, Silas. It beats with the force of a collapsing star," she said, her breath hitching as the color flooded back into her lips. Silas leaned into her touch, his thumb brushing over the iridescent patterns on her neck that were now pulsing in time with his own pulse. "Then take it, Alcyone. Take whatever you need to stay here," he replied, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly timbre that vibrated against her skin. The recovery was not merely clinical. It was a total molecular synchronization that bound them together in a way the Xylosian court found scandalous. In the weeks that followed, Alcyone's physical form underwent a metamorphosis, her skin becoming more vibrant, the colorful filaments in her hair growing longer and more lustrous as they sought the proximity of the human who had saved her. Silas found himself unable to stay away, drawn to her chambers by a magnetic pull that felt less like duty and more like a biological necessity. He walked into her private garden, where the gravity was lower and the air tasted of sweet nectar, finding her draped across a levitating chaise. Her gown was a gossamer fabric that did little to hide the glowing lines of energy tracing the curves of her hips and thighs. "The council says you are dangerous to me, Silas," Alcyone said, not looking up from the bioluminescent flower she was dissecting with her mind. She stood up, the movement fluid and predatory, and glided toward him until her chest was inches from his uniform. "They say your biology is too aggressive, that you are a predator species disguised in silk," she murmured, her hand coming up to rest over his heart. Silas didn't move, though his breathing hitched as she leaned in, her scent reminding him of rain on hot pavement and crushed violets. "Maybe they're right to be afraid, because I don't feel like a diplomat when I'm standing this close to you," he admitted, his hands finding the small of her back and pulling her flush against him. The friction of their bodies caused a literal spark to jump between them, a discharge of excess energy that scorched the air. Alcyone let out a soft, melodic gasp, her head tilting back to expose the graceful arch of her throat, where the glowing veins were thumping wildly. Silas didn't wait for permission. He pressed his lips to that pulse point, tasting the metallic sweetness of her skin. The sensation was overwhelming, a rush of sensory data that flooded his brain with images of her home world and the depths of her loneliness. She arched into him, her fingers digging into his shoulders, her own strength returning in a sudden, violent surge fueled by the adrenaline he was providing. "I need more," she groaned, her voice vibrating against his ear. She spun him around, her movements a blur of alien speed, and pinned him against the stone pillar of the gazebo. "Show me the fire that keeps your kind alive in the dark," she challenged, her eyes burning with a hunger that was entirely unprincess-like. Silas grinned, a sharp, hungry expression that validated every fear her council had about humanity. "Careful, Alcyone. Once you start a fire with a human, you don't get to decide when it stops," he warned, his hands sliding up to frame her face. Their intimacy became a secret war of endurance and discovery, a series of late-night encounters where the lines between healing and passion blurred into insignificance. Silas discovered that his touch acted as a supercharger for her abilities, allowing her to manifest physical light and heat that could melt the very alloys of her palace. One evening, as they lay tangled together on a bed of soft, synthetic moss, Alcyone traced the scars on Silas's chest, her touch leaving trails of faint, shimmering light on his tanned skin. "You are so solid, so heavy in the world," she whispered, her cheek resting against his pec. She looked up at him, her expression turning somber as the glow in her hair dimmed to a soft amber. "My father intends to marry me to the high prelate of the Krell to solidify our borders. He doesn't know what you've done to me," she revealed, her voice trembling. Silas felt a cold surge of possessive rage wash over him, his muscles tensing under her touch. "He can try, but he'll have to go through a Terran fleet to take you," he said, the words a promise of violence that made her shiver with a dark delight. The revelation of their bond came during the Grand Equinox, a ceremony attended by the elite of the sector. The High Prelate, a towering being of translucent cartilage and cold intent, stepped forward to claim Alcyone's hand. The princess looked pale, her energy receding as she neared the cold-blooded suitor. Silas stood among the guards, his hand resting on the hilt of his sidearm, his eyes never leaving hers. When the prelate reached out to touch her, Alcyone recoiled, her body instinctively seeking the resonance she had shared with the human. "I cannot," she announced, her voice echoing through the silent hall. She turned her gaze toward the back of the room, finding Silas in the shadows. "I am already bound to the flame," she declared, pointing a shaking finger at the man who had brought her back from the grave. The high prelate let out a screech of insulted pride, his body shifting into a combat stance as he lunged toward the human. Silas didn't flinch, his human reflexes honed by years of frontier skirmishes kicking in as he sidestepped the attack and delivered a crushing blow to the alien's midsection. The room erupted into chaos, but Silas was a whirlwind of focused aggression, a testament to the evolutionary path of a species that had survived 1,000 extinction events. He fought his way to the dais, his knuckles bruised and bleeding, until he stood before Alcyone. He grabbed her hand, and the moment their skin touched, a shockwave of golden light blasted outward, throwing the guards back and shattering the ornamental glass of the dome. It wasn't just healing anymore. It was a weaponized manifestation of their combined will. "Let's get out of here," Silas shouted over the roar of the alarms, his grip on her hand unbreakable. He led her through the winding corridors of the palace, his knowledge of the facility's vents and maintenance tunnels, gained through weeks of illicit visits, becoming their salvation. "You are insane. You are going to start a galactic war for me," Alcyone laughed, the sound bright and wild as they sprinted toward the hangar bay. "I've started wars for much less, princess," Silas retorted, throwing her into the cockpit of his scout ship. As the ship cleared the atmosphere, chased by the crimson tracers of the planetary batteries, Silas pushed the engines to their limit. He felt Alcyone move behind him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her chest pressing against his back as she channeled her returning power into the ship's systems. The consoles began to glow with her signature violet hue, the engines screaming as they achieved speeds that the ship's designers had never intended. "Where are we going?" she asked, her breath hot against his neck. She turned his chair around, straddling his lap even as the ship bucked and groaned under the strain of the escape. "To Earth! They need to see what happens when a human falls in love with a star," Silas answered, his hands sliding up her thighs to pull her closer. Alcyone leaned down, her lips meeting his in a kiss that tasted of iron and infinity, her body a beacon of light in the dark cockpit. "Then show me, Silas, show me everything," she whispered, her eyes glowing with the fierce, undying light of a woman who had finally found a reason to live. The voyage to the Sol system took weeks through the subspace corridors, a period of time that served as a crucible for their evolving relationship. Inside the cramped confines of the scout ship, there was no royalty or diplomacy, only the raw, visceral reality of two beings whose very essences were becoming intertwined. Silas spent hours teaching Alcyone about Earth, showing her digital archives of oceans and forests, while she shared the ancestral memories of her people, memories that came as vivid, tactile dreams whenever they slept skin to skin. "Your world is so blue, so vibrant," Alcyone remarked one evening, her fingers dancing across a holographic display of the Mediterranean. She looked at Silas, who was stripping down after a long shift in the engine room, his muscles glistening with sweat. "I want to swim in those waters with you, to feel the weight of a world that produced someone like you," she said, her voice dripping with a yearning that was more than just curiosity. Silas walked over to her, his movements heavy and deliberate, and sat on the edge of the bunk. "The water is cold, and the salt stings. It's not like the sterile pools in your palace," he warned, reaching out to pull her into his lap. She laughed, the sound echoing in the small cabin, and wrapped her legs around his waist. The contrast between his rugged, scarred skin and her glowing, ethereal form was a visual representation of the bridge they were building between their species. She pressed her forehead against his, the bioluminescent patterns on her brow flaring into a soft pink. "I am not afraid of the sting, Silas. I am a creature of light who was dying in the dark until you touched me," she reminded him, her hands wandering over his shoulders. She began to unfasten the remaining buttons of his shirt, her eyes never leaving his. "I want to feel every sensation your world has to offer, starting with you," she whispered, her voice dropping to a seductive purr. Silas groaned, his hands tightening on her hips as he lowered her onto the bunk, the ship's artificial gravity humming a low accompaniment to their rising heat. The intensity of their connection began to manifest in physical anomalies within the ship. The air grew ionized, and small orbs of static electricity floated around them like tiny, captive stars. When they reached the peak of their passion, the ship's core would flare in sympathy, the light from Alcyone's skin illuminating every corner of the room in a dazzling display of xeno-biological harmony. It was more than just sex. It was a rhythmic exchange of life force, a human's stubborn refusal to let go, and an alien's newfound will to burn bright. "You're changing me," Silas panted, his heart racing at a speed that would have concerned any doctor. He looked down at his own palms, where faint, glowing lines were beginning to appear beneath the skin, a mirror of her own patterns. "We are becoming something new, a fusion of two worlds," Alcyone said, her voice sounding like a chorus of bells. She pulled him back down to her, her lips seeking his with a desperate, beautiful hunger. "Do not be afraid, Silas. Our love is the only thing that can bridge the void between our people," she assured him, her light engulfing them both. As they neared the edge of the Sol system, the long-range scanners picked up a fleet of Xylosian warships dropping out of warp. The High Prelate had not given up his prize, and he had brought the might of a hegemony to reclaim her. Silas jumped into the pilot's seat, his hands flying over the controls, while Alcyone took her place in the secondary seat, her fingers glowing as she prepared to interface with the ship's weapon systems. "They think we are weak because we are alone," Silas muttered, his teeth bared in a defiant snarl. He looked at the tactical map, seeing the dozens of red icons closing in on their position. "They forget that humans don't know how to give up, and they don't know what you can do now," he said, glancing at Alcyone. Alcyone closed her eyes, her hair standing on end as she tapped into the ship's power grid, her entire body becoming a conduit for pure, unadulterated energy. "Let them come, Silas. Let them see what the fire of humanity has done to the daughter of Xylos," she declared, her voice booming with a power that vibrated the very hull of the ship. The battle was a lopsided affair on paper, but the reality was a nightmare for the Xylosian fleet. Silas piloted the scout ship with a reckless, intuitive grace, pulling maneuvers that would have snapped the neck of any other pilot. Meanwhile, Alcyone channeled her boosted energy through the ship's modest laser arrays, turning them into lances of violet fire that sliced through the heavy shields of the warships like they were made of paper. "Target the lead cruiser, the one with the prelate's markings," Silas directed, his eyes narrowed as he dodged a volley of plasma bolts. He felt the ship lurch as a near miss shook the frame, but he held the course. "I have it, Silas, feel my light," Alcyone cried out, her hands slamming against the console. A beam of blinding radiance erupted from the ship, striking the prelate's vessel and causing its entire structure to vibrate until it simply disintegrated into a cloud of glittering dust. The remaining ships of the fleet hesitated, their commanders shocked by the display of power. In that moment of indecision, a new set of signatures appeared on the radar, the United Earth Defense Force. A dozen heavy destroyers, led by the flagship Ares, dropped out of warp, their massive railguns already tracking the Xylosian invaders. "This is Commander Augustus of the UEDF unidentified vessels. You are intruding on Terran space," a voice crackled over the comms. "Stand down and prepare to be boarded, or we will demonstrate why Earth is called the fortress of the sector," the commander added, his tone cold and uncompromising. Silas let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, his hand finding Alcyone in the dim light of the cockpit. "We're home, Alcyone," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The Xylosian ships, seeing the reinforcements and the destruction of their leader, turned and fled back into the void. Silas guided the scout ship into the docking bay of the Ares, the heavy clunk of the magnetic grapples signaling the end of their flight. As the airlock cycled open, Silas and Alcyone walked out hand in hand, meeting the gaze of the stunned human soldiers who had never seen an alien so beautiful or a human so transformed. "Who are you?" Commander Augustus asked, stepping forward to eye the glowing woman and the scarred diplomat. He looked at Silas, noting the strange, luminous patterns on his skin and the way the princess looked at him with such utter devotion. "I'm Silas, and this is Princess Alcyone," Silas announced, his voice steady and proud. "We've come to negotiate a new kind of treaty, one written in blood and light," he added, pulling Alcyone closer to his side. In the months that followed, the story of the human who saved a princess and the princess who loved a human became a legend that reshaped the galaxy. The peace that followed was not one of cold borders and signed papers, but one of biological and emotional integration. Silas and Alcyone remained at the heart of this new era, their bond serving as a living proof of what was possible when two species stopped fearing the unknown and started embracing the heat. They eventually returned to the Mediterranean, just as Alcyone had wished. On a private beach under the warm sun of Earth, Silas watched her walk into the water, her skin shimmering with 1,000 different colors as it touched the salt spray. She looked back at him, her hair trailing in the wind like a silken banner of light, and beckoned him forward. "The water is perfect, Silas," she called out, her voice carrying over the sound of the waves. She dove into a wave, emerging a moment later with her eyes sparkling like diamonds. "Come and show me how humans survive in this beautiful, wild world," she challenged, a playful grin on her face. Silas didn't hesitate. He ran into the surf, the cool water a welcome contrast to the fire that always burned in his veins whenever she was near. "I'll show you everything, Alcyone, for as long as our hearts keep beating," he promised, catching her in his arms and pulling her deep into the blue. The sun set over the horizon, casting a long, golden glow over the two lovers as they disappeared beneath the surface, a human and an alien, bound together by a touch that had changed the course of history. Their love was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe wasn't a weapon or a starship, but the simple, undeniable warmth of a human heart.